I first saw this woman when I was very young. I knew she lived on the top floor of our old brick apartment building. There's one moment with her I'll never forget. I fled. It was too much to process. Horns don't grow on people. Witches aren't real. Yet, a chilling fear crept back into my life, the same fear I had as a child. "Why, boy, didn't you want your toys?" she whispered. I felt an icy touch and lowered my gaze to see her gripping my arm. "Come with me." Things spiraled further. My once lively mother became withdrawn, spending hours locked in her room. She spoke less, and her cheerful demeanor vanished. She avoided going outside, even to throw out the trash. The neighbor downstairs, Karen, who was once tall and elegant, now looked shrunken and bloated, as though her body had given up on itself. And through it all, the witch remained in the yard. Every time I looked, she was there, barefoot in the frost, her turquoise eyes fixed on nothing or on everything. Her smile, that cruel, otherworldly smile, never left her face. The fear in our building grew, spreading like a sickness. No one spoke of her, but we all felt her presence, her influence. One Sunday morning, I saw her again, standing in the yard. She raised her head and looked straight at my window. I froze, gripping my coffee cup tightly. Her mouth opened in a soundless laugh, and her wrinkles seemed to deepen. At that moment, I heard a strange snorting noise from Uncle Ben's apartment, followed by the stomping of hooves. My mother moved slower than ever, her movements lethargic as if she were weighed down by an invisible force. The witch had returned, and with her, something dark and inexplicable had begun to unravel our lives. "Mom, are you feeling unwell?" I asked. "I'm fine, leave me alone," she replied in a metallic voice. It was the first time in my memory that she had been rude to me. It started to feel like I was living in a dream I couldn't wake up from. The world around me turned gray, foggy, and faded. My mind felt sluggish, my body always weak. I was 5 years old, playing in the sandbox, rolling a toy car along the wooden edges and mimicking engine sounds. Suddenly, she appeared. She stood with her back to me. Her ashy, curly hair floated in the air like wisps of smoke, tangled and dry. She was thin and pale, her sinewy muscles visible beneath her almost translucent skin. She wore nothing but a nightgown, standing barefoot on the cold ground, exuding a chilling presence. "Do you like toys, little boy?" she asked without turning around. Her voice was strangely melodic but unsettling. "I have lots of toys at home, so many toys." The wind howled around us, making her gray hair writhe like serpents. "What kind of toys?" I asked, intrigued and oblivious. Before she could answer, my mother rushed over, yanked me by the arm, and hurried me away. "Harry, never talk to her again," she said sternly. "She's a bad woman." "But why is she bad?" I asked, confused. "She's a witch," my mother whispered, her tone filled with dread. As we left, I glanced back. The woman was facing the sandbox now, and her face was terrifying. Her skin was a maze of deep wrinkles, with no smooth patches, and her eyes, they were pure blue, like turquoise stones without pupils. They were cold, endless. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing unnaturally large, glowing teeth. Fear gripped me so tightly I buried my face in my mother's shoulder. For years, I couldn't shake the memory. Every night before bed, I'd ask, "She won't come here, will she?" "No, don't worry," my mom would reassure me, kissing my cheek and tucking me in. Still, I felt like her icy gaze could pierce through ceilings and into my dreams. Years passed, and I forgot about her. But one foggy November day, I saw her again. I was coming home from school, tired and lost in thought, when I spotted her near the old playground. It was freezing, but there she was, standing barefoot in the same thin nightgown. She looked nearly the same, though skinnier, her skin now taut over her skeletal frame. It seemed she hadn't eaten in years. Her pale feet looked frozen to the ground, but her turquoise eyes, still pupilless, stared blankly, and her unsettling smile hadn't changed. By then, I no longer believed in witches. I figured she was just a mentally ill woman who had slipped through the cracks. How had she survived all these years? Was she in an institution or under someone's care? I walked past her, pitying her, and thought she needed help before the cold claimed her. At home, I mentioned seeing her to my mother. Her reaction was instant. Her eyes widened, and her lips trembled. "Where did you see her?" she demanded. "In the yard," I said, confused. "Should I call someone? Maybe an ambulance?" My mom rushed to the window, pulling the curtain aside nervously. Her face turned pale. "She's still out there, isn't she?" I asked. "Just eat your dinner," she snapped, avoiding my questions. From that day, a strange tension filled our home. It felt like a heavy cloud had settled over us. Then, things started to happen. Our neighbor, Uncle Ben, a jovial man with a round belly and a booming laugh, greeted me one morning as I returned from school, but I noticed a massive bump on his forehead, purple and red, like a grotesque horn trying to break through his skin. "What happened to your head, Uncle Ben?" I asked. "He touched it absent-mindedly, probably just a boil or something," he said, brushing it off. "Nothing to worry about." That night, I heard his muffled sobs through the walls. At first, they were soft, but they grew louder, raw, filled with despair. By morning, they had become hoarse wails. Concerned, I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, I was horrified. The bump on his head had burst, and a twisted, black horn protruded from the wound. Another horn was growing on the other side. His face was streaked with dried blood, his eyes wild with fear. "Do you see them? The horns?" he whimpered. I nodded, paralyzed by shock. "It's her, the witch. She did this," he sobbed. During the day, I decided to take a walk downtown, see something other than my old neighborhood, and shake off this nightmare. Bundling up warmly, I stepped into the stairwell, but immediately ran into her. The witch was standing on the threshold as if waiting for me. It was the first time I had seen her terrifying face up close. Those eyes, filled with emptiness. Her words sounded like a command, and I realized I couldn't resist her. She stole my will, dragging me upward. My legs followed her up the steps as if under their own power. I had never been to the top floor of my building before. I'd always been too afraid. To my surprise, I found there was only one old wooden door with a broken lock at the landing. No other apartments. I wondered where she was taking me and why, but couldn't stop or fight her spell. Everything felt like a dream. She led me into a dark hallway, pushing through cobwebs that brushed my face. I snapped back to my senses and tried to resist, but the witch painfully tightened her grip and dragged me through the corridor into a large, bare room. There was no furniture, only naked walls, without wallpaper, a curtainless window, and a shattered box on the wooden floor. Not just a box, a coffin, black and cracked. Its lid had fallen apart into splintered boards with exposed nails. Breaking free from the witch's iron grip felt like shedding chains, and I ran back through the corridor, out the door, and down the stairs. I raced down, skipping steps, almost tripping over myself. My wrist ached, crimson bruises blooming on my skin. I only wanted to get out of the house, to where the nightmare had no power. Outside, in the dim light, I bumped into something short and didn't notice it in the dark. "Watch where you're going," a shrill, cartoonish voice screeched. I looked down. "Who's this?" "Karen." I didn't recognize her again. She was now barely over a meter tall and resembled a beer barrel. Her body had crumpled like an accordion. Her head and shoulders merged into one lump, with legs like two stumps barely supporting her. She looked like a cruel joke, squashed into a dwarf. "What did she do to you?" I asked. "She's getting revenge on everyone," Karen squeaked. I fled the neighborhood, desperate to escape. Beyond it, the world seemed brighter. Bright lights twinkled around downtown shops, colorful signs glowed, and people laughed, wandering, carefree in the streets. But I felt alien, as if this vibrant dream world wasn't meant for me. It belonged to people untouched by darkness. I knew I'd have to return to that lightless nightmare, home to my defenseless mother. Worries churned in my mind. What might happen to her while I was away? The witch had cursed our neighbors. Maybe now it was our turn. "We have to leave," I thought. But where? I had no father. Whenever I asked about him, Mom changed the subject. Grandma had died years ago, and her apartment was now ours. We had no other relatives we knew of. No money to rent elsewhere. Mom's remote job barely kept us afloat. When I returned home, the yard was silent, eerily still. No footsteps, no barking dogs, no birds chirping. The place seemed dead. Reluctantly, I climbed to the third floor and reached for my keys. Suddenly, a sound startled me from the direction of the neighbor's door. Turning, I froze at the sight of a true demon staring back through the cracked doorway. Twisted black horns sprouted from tangled, greasy hair. A shaggy pig-like snout flared with breath. Sharp ears twitching uncontrollably. Yellow tusks glinted, dripping with saliva. Yet, its eyes weren't beastly, they were human. Uncle Ben's eyes. He had become a demon. Terrified, I fumbled my key into the lock, flung open the door, and darted inside. Darkness swallowed me. "Mom," I shouted, "are you home?" No answer. The house was silent except for the dripping kitchen faucet and a creak from the distant room. Turning on the light, I saw Mom's coat and boots where she had left them. She's home, maybe asleep, I thought, quietly. I approached her room and peered in. The sight froze me in place. Mom stood by the window, her arms raised high, fingers splayed like branches. "Mom," I flipped on the light and nearly collapsed. She wasn't just mimicking a tree, she had become one. Her skin was dry, cracked, like bark. Her hair tangled into a wild nest above her head. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. She couldn't move, only glance at me with tear-filled eyes. "Leave," she whispered without opening her lips. "Go anywhere. Stay with friends. You can't stay here." I screamed, "What's happening? Tell me. Why is she doing this? I don't understand." "This is punishment." Mom's parched, stiff lips barely moved. "For what we did." Mom confessed. The witch had always lived here, doing dreadful things, tolerated by the neighbors until they'd had enough. Fearing for themselves and their children, they cornered her one night while she slept in her coffin. Uncle Ben brought a hammer and nails. They sealed her inside, hoping she was already dead. But she wasn't, and she escaped. "Leave, Harry," Mom pleaded, blinking slowly, tears streaking her bark-like face. "No, Mom, I'm not leaving." I embraced her, sobbing. She was cold and rigid, immovable like oak.